Hello, my name's Damian. Stories stand the test of time, and whether you relate to a story or you're inspired by it, narrative is very powerful. And it was almost 20 years ago, I was in a really dark and dingy classroom in our hospital, and we'd sat through 3 absolutely turgid lectures. And next was a professor of epidemiology. And he came into the room, and I thought, this is going to be disastrous. And we sat there, and we were inspired. This guy had massive, big, bushy eyebrows. And although he was small, his enthusiasm for his subject filled the room. And I found myself getting excited about what he was talking about was fat Scottish men and how the fact if you gave them simvastatin, they didn't die of kind of cardiac deaths, but the all-cause mortality was the same. And this was a study from 20, 30 years ago showing the power of statins. And that was 20 years ago, and I think that was my introduction to someone who was passionate about research, and I wanted to go out and do the same thing. And there is a lot of hidden, unbelievably good pediatric research. So put your hand up if you know what this is the logo for. Excellent. Okay, so this is the Cochrane Collaboration. But what's brilliant about this particular logo is it says something. It describes a fantastic study. And the 2 big circles around the sides, that's for global collaboration. But the lines in the middle, the horizontal lines, are individual studies. And those individual studies are summated into the diamond at the bottom. And the diamond says whether it's on the left side, as you're looking at it, of whether those studies had an impact, whether they were beneficial, or on the right side there was no effect. So this is a combination of studies which have an effect. And this is a diagram of antenatal steroids given to mums who go into preterm labor. It's a forest plot, and it's a forest plot of an amazing pediatric study which has saved thousands, if not millions, of lives worldwide. So the stories, the research narrative that we have is really important. And we've moved on. So we used to tell stories around campfires. We now do it at a global, worldwide connected stage. And this conference, you are part of a developing community of practice who will take away what you've learned and you will disseminate it, whether it's by social media or word of mouth, it doesn't matter. You are part of a bigger mess, as it were, of knowledge. The problem is that that's brilliant if the stories are correct. But what if the story's wrong? And what do we do when a narrative starts that goes unfettered or unchecked? What are the risks and balances? And so I want everyone to understand that they have a responsibility. I don't care whether you understand stats or you like research. Everyone in this room has something to do with caring for and dealing with children. So it is all our responsibilities to have some interest in the way that evidence is applied and clinical practice takes place. So it doesn't really bother me whether you're amazing at putting in cannulas. You may be fantastic at communicating with children. You may have other special skills, but we all need to understand the way that clinical practice works and how evidence is applied. And when I woke up this morning, I had butterflies in my stomach. And actually, I've not been as nervous about giving a lecture in a very long time, such was the standard of kind of yesterday's talks. And I almost felt sick. And sickness is a very common thing for those of us who work with children. It's part and parcel of our lives. Kids vomit. It is what they do. Better out than in is what my parents used to say, and what a lot of kind of my senior colleagues used to teach me when I was a medical student. And we see a lot of gastroenteritis presenting, and that gastroenteritis may be treated as something as simple as apple juice. This is the apple juice study. Came out very recently. What an American group did was that they showed that children given apple juice did just as well, if not better, in terms of kind of relapse rate or need for IVs than standard therapies. The real problem was that these were all children who were defined as had mild dehydration. You only had to have vomited 3 times or had 3 lots of diarrhea to be in the study. In fact, they excluded people who were moderately or severely dehydrated. And they also put in the study that if you vomited in the emergency department, you could get some ondansetron. Now, ondansetron is a great drug. Lots of Cochrane reviews, lots of evidence suggesting that it's relatively safe, it's efficacious, it prevents admission, etc., etc. And we often get asked as clinicians, well, my child's vomiting, can you do something about it? We live in a click and collect culture now. People want answers. They want their child treated. They don't want to take time off school. They don't want to sit up with their kids night after night after night dealing with them. People want their problem solved in the same way as they can pick up their phone and dial the bank and book your holiday. But healthcare sadly doesn't work like that. So we have a challenge, we have a pressure that is being placed on us about maybe giving treatments for a self-limiting illness. And there is a GP academic in London called Alistair Hay who was quite concerned about this spread of ondansetron into primary care because we could start giving it out like Smarties. Now, in the previous study, you'll note that I didn't give any p-values. And there is a lot of debate in the academic presentation world about the way you show stats and such like. P-values are used notoriously badly. If you get your magic 0. less than 0.05, then hurrah, you've saved the world. I just wanted to give you a slight example of why 0.05 might not be such a magic number, because less than 0.05 is really that different than 1 in 20. And here are 20 Premier League clubs. Now, yesterday I was in a talk where there was literally a stand-up argument, if not a fight, about whether Aussie rules is better than rugby league, okay? Neither of them are decent forms of football. It's this term, soccer, that the Americans use, but this is the true art of football. And every so often, you get a surprise result. So in 2015 and 16, Leicester won the Premiership. 1 in 20, that was their chance, technically, if all things being equal. So random results do happen, and we get very het up on spreading the news about one particular result just because of a single number. So just bear in mind, it is as simple as 1 in 20. So I've talked about ondansetron as maybe a medication where it might be used a little unnecessarily. So let's talk about another study. This is Magnetic. Magnetic was a study of magnesium sulfate, a substance which we feel probably improves the care of adults and children who have asthma. And the aim of Magnetic was to show it in nebulized form, it improved children's care. So we had 2 arms, 300 children in both group, and if they were felt to have moderate or severe asthma, they were randomized to either get 3 lots of salbutamol or 3 lots of salbutamol and magnesium sulfate. And lots of people, who thinks that the outcome of that trial that we should be using magnesium sulfate? Ooh, so you're a well-read audience, or you're just not willing to put your hands up. Because the interesting thing about that particular study is that they didn't find a difference. They looked at the asthma severity score and found that actually there was no difference between the groups in the asthma severity score after an hour. However, if you do a post hoc analysis, i.e. you kind of look at the results trying to find a result, you find that those children who had low SATs when they presented, had symptoms for less than 6 hours, they were a group that did seem to improve when you gave them magnesium sulfate. But we have this challenge with asthma, a bit like kind of dehydration, is that we're not very good at actually making a diagnosis correctly about the severity of disease. So the challenge with magnetic is which children are going to benefit? Is it those who are moderately affected, severely affected? Is my definition of severely the same as yours? Is your definition the same as yours? And we're creating lots of paradigms in the way that we do research, because especially the Americans have a lot of money. They do large studies where they have research nurses or research personnel recruiting into the studies, and they're the people making the judgments. These are explanatory trials. They're not pragmatic. What I mean by pragmatic is that's how the real world works. And in the real world, you get juniors making a decision on dehydration and seniors as well. And so we have a problem that we might be producing research which gives us slightly the wrong result, not because the original research is bad, it's because it's the way it's applied might be different than its setting. So another example of this, let's go off medications, is to kind of treatments or interventions, is high-flow humidified oxygen. So this is an amazing story, because if you go out and look for the study that says that high-flow humidified oxygen will do something beneficial in your emergency department for children with bronchiolitis or respiratory disease, you're going to struggle to find anything that has been done effectively in a randomized, controlled fashion. Yeah, I can tell you, you've probably seen a child who has improved in front of your eyes. And I find it very difficult to be not biased about this treatment, because I too have applied high-flow humidified oxygen to a little child with bronchiolitis, and they seem to have got better. But I don't know if I'm applying it to the right child. Would that child have got better anywhere? And there is actually very little evidence to suggest that, especially in an emergency department, which is where I work, that we should be using this at all. But it is a very simple, easy-to-use treatment, and it spreads. Stories go round. There is a narrative about how easy it is to apply and how it works. So let's take another kind of type of instrument, that of ultrasound. Now, do not get me wrong. You guys, I know, have had a fantastic ultrasound session this morning. I am not anti-ultrasound. I think we should be using it more and more frequently. But we do need to make sure we're using it on the right patients. This is an interesting recent study in the Emergency Medicine Journal, where they basically ran, as kids arrived, they all had an ultrasound by an experienced radiologist. And then the child was just left to their own devices and given a diagnosis. And then they checked how the diagnosis related to any abnormal ultrasound findings. And what the study said was that you might be able to rule in pneumonia and rule out asthma on the basis of an ultrasound. That's a potentially quite dangerous precedent to set, given the fact the amount of bronchiolitis in both groups was the same, and that what we're doing is we're trying to make someone else do the work. So the ultrasound might be a supportive treatment for these respiratory conditions, but I'd certainly be a bit adverse to start making a whole pathway based on kind of small amounts of data. And there is a glowing trend, I think, in a lot of research coming out, is let's try and remove the workload from the clinicians as much as possible. And I'm not always sure that that's a safe or wise thing to do. Who works with pediatric early warning scores or systems in their institution? Okay, so you either have between the flags, or there's all sorts of different systems and scores out there, and they're ubiquitous. And they cause lots of dichotomies because they come with biases. There's a lot of people who believe that they will spend their whole night being phoned because this child's persistently scoring. And despite the use of some Pew systems, we still have children who suddenly deteriorate and crash. And so what we have is a real problem with, is this a fake Pews or not? And the research really doesn't help us in this regard, because again, we're obsessed with a single intervention giving us a single outcome without any form of context or culture. And actually, it's becoming more and more evident that actually if we ignore the way communication works, if we ignore situational awareness, if we ignore human factors, if we ignore parent or carer concern, these are all vital things that give a picture about the deteriorating child. And to be reliant on a set of observations summing to a score actually, to me, doesn't seem a particularly wise thing to do. So how do we kind of cope or respond to some of these challenges of clinical practice? Well, what we really want to be doing is reducing variation. One of the best ways of reducing variation is convincing people that variation in practice exists. So this is a blog from Andy Tagg, who spoke yesterday, and it's reviewing a paper that looked at variation in the treatment of bronchiolitis. And bronchiolitis is an amazing disease because it appears every winter, whichever hemisphere you're in, and it lasts for a couple of months, and it's the same type of disease process, and the same things happen, and we can predict it's going to happen, but if we look at what we do to treat it, we all do things completely differently. Even on the same shift, I'm sure that there will be occasions where one child gets a nebulizer, another doesn't, one child gets fluids, another doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. And trying to reduce that variation is becoming increasingly important. And one of the best ways that we can become aware of the variation is spreading knowledge, is telling stories about the fact that there is variation. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight is the great work that Don't Forget the Bubbles do with kind of spreading the word and looking at research and presenting it to you guys in a way that is accessible and easy to read. And so there is a final piece of the puzzle, because what I've not really mentioned so far is the role of the patient or the parent or carer themselves in helping us into a journey to get better outcomes. And one of the greatest studies of the last 2 years, I think, was the big study by Steve Cunningham. So he did a very clever thing. He got a saturations monitor, and he changed the saturations monitor, so when it was reading 90%, that was the true sats, the machine told you it was reading 94%. And so they did a randomized control trial of a device that lied, basically. And they looked at children who had come in with bronchiolitis, and they told the one group who had the lying monitor that actually this child had sats of 94% when actually they had 90%. And what they found is in the groups, there was essentially very little difference. And there was some evidence to suggest that actually the group that had the truly lower sats may have had better outcomes. And it's a very impressive study. How they got that through ethics, I still have absolutely no idea, but good on them. But the key thing about that study actually wasn't the fiddling with the monitor, it was the outcome they chose. Because the outcome wasn't admissions to PICU, it wasn't length of stay in hospital, it wasn't interventions, it was a parent-centered outcome. It was time to resolution of cough. That was their primary outcome. And the time to resolution to cough was about 11 days in the lying device arm and about 15, I think, in the control arm. Now, I'm not sure they may have got the numbers they needed to do that type of study by doing it another way, because the other outcomes were so close together. They would have needed thousands of patients to show the differences, but they chose a parent-centered outcome. And one of the things that I think is going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years is we're going to see more studies based on what parents and maybe children and young people want to see, rather than some kind of nebulous number chosen by us as clinicians. And we're going to have to face that challenge. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to need to do bigger and better studies. And there's a whole host of emergency research networks out there. And if you're not in the emergency department, there are similar networks in general pediatrics, etc. So I'm part of PERUKI, which is the UK Paediatric Emergency Research arm, and we're under this banner of PERN. And Predict, the team from Predicts were speaking yesterday, and there's a whole host of fantastic research going on at a global scale. And you can find out who is your kind of either regional or national lead, and you can help them. You can get involved in studies and empower yourselves in a very easy way. There's another thing that you can do as well, is that you can follow some of our brilliant critical clinicians. So someone that I did want to speak about is Casey Parker, sitting in the front row over here, runs a website called Boondocks, is a fantastic advocate of critical appraisal and analysis. Does a regular blog taking a paper, dissecting it in a way that makes it easy to understand so people can really judge for themselves how evidence in practice is working. And I think we are part of a growing community of people who are not willing just to sit there and let academics like myself go off on a tangent. We are all part of this bigger picture. And I would invite you to be really pleased about the work that the Don't Forget the Bubbles team have put in providing you what is a great conference venue. There's been great food, there's been some great talks, but most importantly, it's creating a great community of practice so that we're all working together to get the best out of ourselves, and most importantly, get the best outcomes for the children and young people that we see and treat. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Damian. That was fantastic. Amy, over to you.
We've just got a few comments again, a lot of interest in the Twitter community. Nicola Campbell was very impressed with your explanation about the origin of the Cochrane logo, and she hopes it comes up in the next trivia night at her local pub, so that's good. And then there was a general sort of theme about this passion for paediatric research and encouraging that and the ownership of different clinicians to support that locally. You've mentioned a few of the social media kind of strategies in how to support that. How do you go about that on a day-to-day basis where you work?
Well, one of the things that I'm kind of finding, especially in my the junior staff that I work with, is that they're, and this is anecdote, I have absolutely no evidence for this at all, but compared to 10 years ago, I get the impression that people are more aware of what is happening and they're more engaged because they're able to reach research in a way they weren't before. So the kind of the FOAMed community and other social media networks have provided an accessibility to understanding academic work in a way that wasn't possible a decade ago, so that people are actually quite enthused. Now, I know that those of you who are heavy Twitter users may be sick of the VL versus DL debate. I personally, it kind of does my head in over time. And there are lots of other passionate stuff that might go OTT, but ultimately those conversations are happening all the time and involving people in a way that actually kind of 15, 20 years ago, it was only left to a small cohort of people. And I'm quite excited by the amount of people who are actually really interested in research that's going on and applying evidence in a way that I don't think happened 10 years ago. And it's not all to do with social media, but I'm convinced part of it definitely is.
Terrific.
I guess that I've got a question. Being a busy clinician, and you're a dad, and hopefully you have some sort of life outside of that as well, how on earth do you juggle research with clinical work? Because one of the things that concerns me with all this talk about burnout and resilience is I feel like we're also asking a lot more of people, and that goes across the board, where it's like, can you please, dedicate 15 years of your life to study, and then you finally, get to where you want to go, but why aren't you doing any research, and why aren't you presenting at conferences, and why aren't you blogging, and why aren't you, it never seems to have a ceiling to it. So how do you get to a point where you can actually find a way to be interested or to participate or have a taster of research without enrolling in a PhD, which for me has been the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life.
So I think there's two questions in there. So it's how you get involved in research without feeling that you've got the burden of kind of academia. And I think there's lots of especially the research networks that I mentioned. I think that if you can be involved in the studies that they are doing, that's a pretty easy way of getting an introduction, because their studies are very pragmatic, kind of on-the-ground type stuff, and there's always someone around to help you a hand. Our networks, especially PERUKI, want to grow. We want to get people involved, and we can support people doing that. And actually, just reading some of the literature and some of the work that goes out via the blogs. St. Emlyn's is another brilliant example of people who are able to take work that might be a bit inaccessible and make it much more easy to digest. But then there's another question, I suppose, about how do you manage your workload. I'm a dreadful role model, so do not do what I do, because I'd like to think that I take breaks. I'd like to think that I organise my time well, but I don't, if I'm really honest with myself. I work a little too hard. I find it very difficult to kind of turn the keyboard off at times, and my only saving grace is I suppose is having that awareness and that reflection that sometimes I'm putting too much in and not getting enough out at the other side. And so listening to my own internal monologue, which is pretty boring, I can tell you, it's sometimes...
Did you have to be a woman, Damian? Seriously.
Thank you. It's a good thing to do.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, please thank Damian Roland.